Travis looked out the window at the green hills rolling past the car window. He smiled at the stone wall stretching out along the road. A few minutes in silence later, and the driver pulled into a car park and turned back to look at him. Girly bog. Travis nodded at him while looking down at his smartphone. 5 stars, plus a tip. The driver, Curtis, nodded. I guess you'll be needing me. I'm the only bloke around. Travis smiled with a sigh. Yep, you did good. Kept the chat to a minimum. Thank you, he said as he started to exit the door. Curtis got out and popped open the trunk. Your bag, sir? Thanks again. See you probably this evening. Curtis smiled as he shut the trunk and went back to the driver's door. He waved out the window as he drove off. Travis stood with his suitcase and full backsack as he started looking around. A woman stepped out from a path amongst the trees. Professor Hawkins? She said, smiling. He smiled back. Dr. Adams? She nodded slightly, approaching with her hand outstretched. It's good you made it out, she said, shaking his hand. He took a breath as he looked around. Beautiful country. The greens remind me back home. She laughed. I didn't know you were American. Teaching here in Dublin? Yeah. I've always liked traveling, figured it was time to start seeing the prettier parts of the world. She motioned him back toward the path. Camp is set up over the next rise. You okay in a tent? He chuckled as he pulled the suitcase behind him. I've been okay sleeping in holes. A tent is a luxury. Good. I have a couple student interns with me, but for the most part, it's all me out here. He looked around at the deep mud off either side of the path. I read some of your report. Excavating a Celtic mound, right? She looked back at him. Some? Busy guy. You needed a metallurgist, college sent me. Here I am. Well, yeah, pretty much. She smiled at him as she started speaking with her hands more. Well, we're thinking it's a sacrificial site. Maybe some sort of spiritual center. She looked back ahead as they walked. The bodies are super preserved, charred but preserved. Some sort of burnt offering, maybe enemies they sacrificed. We're still working on pulling them out, but that's not why you're here. She turned back with a smile. Yeah, why am I here? Find a cool sword or something? He laughed. I'm a fan of Vikings. She shook her head. No, Vikings come much later. This is old here. Honestly, I have no clue what we're dealing with. That's why you're here. She pointed as they turned the corner. Go ahead and get set up in that blue tent there. Rodney! A young man with a thin mustache stepped up from a hole. Yes, Fiona? She waved him over. Come meet Professor Hawkins. Help him get set up and then bring him over to the coverstones. He smiled and stepped through the mud to help Travis. Rodney stood outside the tent watching while Professor Hawkins unpacked. After he was done, Travis stepped out, laughing. Thanks for the help, bud. Rodney tapped his muddy left boot on his right. I'll help where I can, but I didn't want to mess your temp home. Travis shrugged. No worries, he said, patting the young man on the shoulder. Take me over to the coverstones she was talking about. Rodney smiled and started walking. Mind the wet areas. They'll drag you down. Travis followed him closely. Still, his boot found a deep spot and sunk near to the top. The intern laughed quietly and then pointed at the hole he was in earlier. Got a pump in that one under the muck. Took me a week to set up those walls to keep the water from just flowing in. Professor Hawkins peered over, noticing the rocky foundations at the bottom. That where you pulled the metal items from? No, Rodney said, laughing. Those are still in the ground. We're not moving them without you. He looked back at the hole they were passing. That hole was where we found 2 of the burned men. Travis nodded slowly. The burned men, right? Rodney waved him on. Come on, this way through the grove. I bet she'll be down on it. He looked back at him. She's super excited you're here. Been waiting all week, you knows. Good I'm wanted somewhere, Travis said, laughing. Rodney slogged on through the muddy path, his feet sucking in the mud. So you're a blacksmith or something? Travis shook his head. No, well, yes, used to be. I got started smithing, but I got intrigued and continued learning the science behind it. Couple papers and here I am. You just started smithing? Like a hobby or something? Travis pulled his boot up, high-stepping over a deep, black wet spot. Yeah. He crossed over, taking Rodney's hand to stabilize himself. GI Bill. Never stop learning. He looked up at the young man. After I retired from the army, I kept busy. Got a farm going, goats, horses, rows of squash and corn. Growing up, I had horses, and shoeing was always fascinating to me. I took some classes, learned the basics, then took more. I went from horseshoes to goldsmithing to full-on metal engineering class. After that, I studied at a local foundry back home in the States, and then I came here. Dublin, right? Travis nodded. Yeah, I got me a flat there with the wife. Rodney smiled at him. Kid's going to be Irish? He shook his head. Too old for that, they're all grown. He sighed a bit. I got a couple grandbabies back in North Carolina I need to go visit, probably next month. Congrats, sir, bet they're cute. Buttons, Travis replied. So, Fiona laughed a bit when I mentioned a sword. Rodney nodded. You'll have to see it. He pointed as they entered a clearing of purple flowers. Fiona Adams raised her hand up from a large, wide hole. 3 pumps near the far edge echoed across the bog as they pumped water out of the site. Travis approached the edge and looked down at the excavation. The mud was stained with the multicolored corrosion of the metals. He hopped down quickly, sliding without care of the filth rubbing onto his pants and shirt. He walked over beside her, staring down at the exposed aggregate. What am I looking at? She looked down at it, and then back up at him, laughing again. A shrine? I don't know, actually. Just speculation. She looked back down and poked a chunk of corroded hardpack with her trowel. We've been scared to pull it out without you. I want to minimize damage to the pieces. Travis knelt down, touching the green and red chunk poking out. He then looked at the serpentine shape outlined in the mud. How many pieces are there? She scratched her forehead, leaving a mud streak. Not sure till we get them out, but, she pointed out, we have 7 large sections. I'm thinking maybe they made a metal boat or something. He stood up, shaking his head. This is a lot. I didn't bring enough solvents for this. He pinched his chin, thinking. We can pull one of the smaller ones up carefully, clean at least one. Maybe we can get a feel for what we're working with. She stood up beside him. How you think they got this much iron? He looked at her, doing a double take. What? No, this isn't iron. Look at all the colors. Iron rusts red. He pointed out across the site. No, there's copper there. Hell, that white there might be traces of magnesium or rhodium. He laughed. You might have a plane crash here. She shook her head. No, this isn't a plane. This is an early Celtic site. He looked back at her, staring. She pointed at the far wall where 3 large stones were propped up. Those stones laid over this entire thing. They're rune-carved, and we dated the corpses on top of them. They're near 3,000 years old. He blinked slowly. 3,000. He shook his head. Maybe someone moved them on top. He waved his hand over toward a smaller of the discolored clumps. I bet a plane, but you never know. I say we start there. She glared back at him. All right, let's start there. Beth had returned with sandwiches from Bray's bar in town by the time Travis and Fiona had the first hung of colored mud, gently hewn from the surrounding clay and muck. The quartet paused the work and joined her on the upper embankment overlooking the dig. Beth handed out the brown paper-wrapped meals and poured ale from the carrier box into their cups. Travis tipped his head and raised the glass. Thank you. Beth smiled at him. You're welcome. Fiona scooted up beside Travis, unwrapping her sandwich. So, still think it's a plane? Travis took a bite and chewed for a moment before replying, shading his eyes from the sun. So far, it's just rainbow-colored mud and some spear points. No telling, but given the probable metals in it, it's something this century. Maybe a bus? Beth laughed and choked. A bus? Someone buried a bus here in Gurley? Rodney sighed. Probably still full of bodies if so. Might have to call in the police. Travis shrugged. We'll find out shortly. We get that bit there out. He pointed at the mud on the screen. Get that there up and washed and we'll have a better idea of what we're digging up. He looked over at Fiona. Those cover plates. You know what the runes say? She laughed. Spiral, dot. Triscales mostly. Not a real writing system, just symbols. Oh, he said before taking another bite and then squeezing in some chips. She paused a moment. There was one pictograph I liked there on the center block. It's unique to here, never seen anything like it. Rodney nodded, chewing. Yeah, I know that one. The big bird. Fiona took a sip of beer and looked at Travis. There's a carving there, a big bird surrounded by tiny men. The men are on fire, Beth said, staring down into the pit. Fiona looked at her. Still up for interpretation. Travis laughed. People on fire up for interpretation? Figure it would be easy to figure that out. They could be on fire. They could be holy men. They could have campfires around. We have no context. Fiona continued. Rodney pointed out where Beth was looking. We've pulled burned bodies out of here. We have context. Travis took another bite, and the group sat quiet, thinking for a moment. Sacrifices to a bird deity, then? They have big eagles in Ireland back then? Fiona shook her head. Not that I know of. After lunch, the quartet went back down into the pit and pulled up the clump of multicolored mud. As a team, they carried the wood frame, holding it over to Professor Hawkins's tent. They hefted up onto his plastic table and then maneuvered it up and over into the wash basin. Fiona sighed and wiped the sweat from her forehead. You really gonna wash that in here? Travis paused and nodded at her. Yeah, why? She pointed over at the bed a few feet away. Chemicals in and around in your sleeping bunk? He laughed. They're not harsh, just enough to get the debris off. He looked around at the team. Don't get any shit on my bed, okay? He pointed with a smile. I sleep there. They all nodded as he sat down at the basin. He turned on the battery-powered pump and the fluid began trickling over the clump. Clay and mud washed free as he gently began brushing. Little by little, spots of gleaming material appeared from under the bright earthen mud. Rodney gave an audible, "Ooh!" Travis continued until something recognizable took shape and all four paused. Fiona leaned in, pointing. That's a gauntlet! What the fuck is a gauntlet doing here? Travis pushed more mud free. This is an alloy, shiny, chromium alloy. Inconel, if I didn't know any better. Someone is fucking with you guys. Rodney leaned in. The fingers are weird. What is that 6 fingers? The dude have that poly hand whatever? Travis leaned back, shaking his head. This is a joke. Archaeology my ass. You guys fucking with me? He looked up at Fiona and stood up. The university is paying good money for me to be here and you're wasting everyone's time. Fiona shook her head, raising her hands. No, not at all. This was here, we dug it up. You helped us, you saw. Rodney raised his hands up. I don't know either, man. Travis paused and looked back at the mud, sighing. It would have been hard to fake that leaching into the mud like that, though. The crystallization and draw would have taken decades, if not centuries. He shook his head. Whatever. No. I don't know how you did it, but that is not from the time frame you're talking about. Fiona took a deep breath and stared at him. I don't know what that is or when it is from, but I swear we didn't put it there. It's a mystery, fake or not. Your time, your knowledge is still needed here to figure this out. He shook his head. No old swords, jewelry maybe? I got gear to identify anything like that. This proper ID and manufacturing location I can do from my labs back home. Rodney looked around. So what? We clean it up and send it back with you? Travis walked toward the entrance of the tent and looked out over the dig areas. Beth, head into town and get me a big bucket of CLR. We can dig up the rest of it and wash it clean. Then we'll rent a U-Haul or whatever you have here and get it back to my flat. I can have it all identified by the end of the month. Fiona stepped up beside him. Then we'll quit eating up your time. Travis nodded. Then I can see my grandbabies. Yeah. Beth walked past them. I'll have to go to Kells. It'll take me a couple hours. Fiona raised her hand. Rodney, go with her. Professor Hawkins and I will begin digging up the other pieces. Yes, ma'am, the intern said before walking out to catch up with Beth. They spent the next couple days removing the other clumps of corroded mud, setting them aside on their own cupped pallets. One by one, they lifted them free of the pit and used a newly purchased cart to get them lined up at Travis's tent. The 4th night of his stay, he started the washing. Beth sat beside him, carefully removing and sorting the debris removed. Fiona and Rodney stood back, ready to carry pieces in. He started washing the piece from the far edge of the pit. Mud washed off into the basin easily, revealing a long silver metal piece. Travis disregarded it and handed it off to Rodney. Quickly, the team had another clump for the wash. He sighed and continued, adjusting his safety goggles several times so he could wipe the sweat from his forehead. The next piece was larger, from the far opposite end. As he washed, its form began emerging. Spines rose out from the mud, glimmering in silvers and golds. Multicolored, oily hues glistened across the surface. Travis paused and then continued cleaning, care re-entering his work. Fiona stepped closer as an eye socket appeared, then row after row of teeth lining the bottom of the now apparent skull. "What the fuck is that?" Rodney leaned over and Beth stood up beside him. That's weird, right? Travis stared at the skull of alloyed precious metals. He then looked up at Fiona. This, I don't know how." He stammered, standing. He looked back down at the skull with his hand at his chin. "The gold and platinum in this is worth, I don't know, $1 million at least. No one in their right mind would waste this and bury it out here. What the hell kind of prank is this?" Rodney laughed, pointing. "Banksy! Banksy is fucking with us!" Beth laughed. Fiona took a deep breath. "I don't know, but we carry on. This is still an archaeological dig and we will treat it as such. If this is a hoax, then our science will sleuth it out." Travis looked over at her. "And if it's not?" She smiled. "Then our science will sleuth it out." He nodded at her slowly. "Rodney, we need this guarded. No one is to know about it. Get a truck from in town and you're going to take this to my wife at my flat. I have a precious metals vault there." He looked at Beth. "You're going to escort with him." He pulled his phone from his pocket and pulled up his wife's tab. The phone tried to ring and then abruptly died. "Damn it! I guess I need to charge it." Fiona pointed over at his solar charger near the edge of the tent. "Charge it up while they go and get the truck. Your solar battery should have juice in it. We'll organize the drive with your wife once you get a bit of juice in it." He nodded and then waved the younger interns off. He stared at Fiona. "Fake or not, this is a treasure." She looked at the skull as it gleamed from under the LEDs. "History books are going to have a chapter about this." She smiled. "This is big, Banksy or not." Beth and Rodney had returned and were packing up the alloyed skull of precious metals when Travis had finished rigging the pump to a large plastic basin to wash the largest clump. The two interns finished wrapping and securing the skull and then came out of the truck to help Fiona and Travis lift the meter and a half-long mass of mud and clay into the tub. They set it down, and Travis began putting on his gloves and goggles. Rodney got brushes and trowels for everyone, and they then began to lean over and remove the detritus. The clay easily dissolved in the oily brine mix, and Beth was the first to find something of interest. She pulled up a small, glimmering spheroid. "What is it?" she asked Travis. He looked and shrugged, pointing over at the collection tray. "We'll figure it out later." He then continued pulling off clumps of rainbow-hued crystalline muck. With each pull, the quartet discovered more and more of the shiny metal carapace underneath. It was hollow on the inside with holes matching where the alloy arms would have been connected. Professor Hawkins paused and leaned onto his heels. "So, is it like a suit of armor or something?" Fiona aimed the hose into the internals and began washing out the mud. "I'm thinking some sort of idol. Gold and silver wouldn't have been good armor worth too much to brittle, right?" Travis shook his head and hit the outer hull of the thing. It rang out. "I bet I could hit this thing with my truck and it wouldn't dent it." Fiona sighed, focused still on washing out the internals. "Still a mystery. I like it." She smiled, unnoticing the tiny black flakes washing out into the basin by Beth. The flakes spun around in the brine, circling each other, clumping together. Beth noticed them just as they snapped tight into a ball. The pump immediately stopped. "What the fuck?" They all stared at it, spinning in the fluid. Travis leaned closer, reaching out just as it ignited. Everyone jumped slightly back. Fiona leaned forward again, staring. "What? That's on fire! That's on fire!" Rodney was already up and running toward their storage container. "I'll get it! I'll get it!" he said as he ducked inside, looking for the extinguisher. Travis stared at it. The fluid was starting to create a current leading into it. He raised his hand up slightly toward it. It's cold. How's that cold? Fiona looked back and forth from the sphere to Travis. Those chemicals are flammable. Travis nodded and quickly grabbed the sphere and pulled it out of the soupy brine. He rolled it across the ground where it stopped in a puddle. It quickly doused just as Rodney ran up and sprayed it down with the extinguisher. The quartet stood the black ball in the puddle. Beth broke the silence. Think we should get the Geiger counter out? Fiona motioned at Rodney. He sighed and handed her the extinguisher before going back to the container. He returned and knelt down next to the sphere with the apparatus in hand. He chirped periodically. He then looked up at everyone. Less than a banana. Beth looked over at Professor Hawkins. How? Travis shrugged. By evening, they had set up a test site down in the hole. Fiona used a set of thick leather welding gloves and carried the sphere down to the drained hole. Rodney had dammed up a large puddle of water, ready to open a makeshift sluice to fluid it should anything happen. Travis watched as Fiona sat it down on a plate in the center of the hole. The dampness on its surface quickly dried, evaporating, and then a blue flame appeared near the top of it. Fiona looked at him. What is it, you think? Beth held up the Geiger counter. Still minimal. Travis took a can of oil and slowly poured a dribble onto the sphere and pulled it back. The black clump of flakes swelled and the flame grew from blue to a bright red. He looked up at Fiona. No idea, but I could see why they made the idol for it. Beth knelt down looking at it. It's like an eternal flame, right? Rodney laughed. Wow. Imagine never having to light a campfire. You could just come with a stick and touch that thing. Travis laughed, setting the oil down. He ran over to the carved clay stairs and went up toward the wood. He returned with a branch and began pulling the leaves off. He then reached over, touching the sphere. The branch ignited. He smiled at Fiona and pulled it away. The flame on the end died out, and Travis's face changed to quizzical. Rodney pointed back at the sphere. Travis poked it again, igniting the stick, then withdrew it. The bright flame died back down. The flame stays localized. That's weird. It pulls it back in or something, Fiona motioned. Poke it more. Travis complied and poked it fully onto the sphere. The branch glowed red, then white, consumed as Travis pushed it further into it. The flame grew. Beth pointed at the sphere. What's that white bit there? Travis looked at a spot growing on the sphere. Looks like mercury or something. Fiona got up and left the pit. She returned a few minutes later with a bundle of sticks. They each took one and began poking the black flaked orb. Beth had sat the Geiger counter down to go get sandwiches from the ice chest. The group had sat around the yellow and red flame, poking it, feeding it sticks as night fell. Rodney had gotten up and returned with several logs. When Beth had gotten back with the sandwiches, the flame had engulfed the logs and was now starting to emit a fair amount of heat. They began eating and drinking, laughing and talking with wide smiles. Fiona watched the stars high above, the flames casting light on the walls of the pit. This thing, whatever it is, they gave sacrifices to it here. Beth was yawning. I can see that. They built a town around it. Rodney pointed. A society of fire worshippers. Travis held his knees as he sat, staring at it deep in the coals. The mercurial metal had swelled around its base. I still don't know. Fiona laughed. Don't know? This thing is the heart of this whole complex here. She pointed at it. It's clear they worship that stone. He shook his head. Science will sleuth it out, he said, staring at her. Rodney looked back and forth at them. It's getting late. We going to put it out, go to bed? I like it, Beth said. Fiona looked over at her. We could sleep here, I guess. You guys okay with that? Rodney looked up at the open sky. Weather's good next few days. I could go get our bedrolls if you guys want. Travis nodded. Rodney got up and went to go get the bedding. Travis let the logs die down as he laid in his bedroll on middle ledge of the hole. The cold clay helped cool his back as he got comfortable in the sleeping bag. He watched the coals around the black sphere as his eyes got heavier. He eventually drifted to sleep. The last thing he consciously felt was the warmth on his face. He woke up hot. Someone was screaming. He opened his eyes and struggled against the bedding. There was fire everywhere. He looked around as waves of rolling flame filled the pit. He looked around and saw Beth ducking from a flame reaching toward her. Fiona was next to her with the extinguisher, shooting puffs into the cloud of flame and smoke near them. He followed the flame down toward its source and saw the coals of Rodney, his plastic bedding outlining his form aflame. The black sphere, no, silver sphere, was hovering above the motionless young man. "Hell, shit, fuck!" Travis yelled. "Spray Rodney!" Fiona looked at him, her face pale with fear. "We did! It's alive!" Travis blinked several times. "What?" Beth pointed at the sphere. "Look at the flame!" Travis looked at the cloud spreading above them. He watched, could see it. The flame moved counter to the wind and smoke. Branches of fire splayed out, growing from the root of Rodney's body. "It's like wings! They're like wings!" Fiona nodded. "The Firebird!" Travis stared. "Damned phoenix!" He looked around, saw a stick, and crawled toward it. A wing of flame pushed down at him, and he rolled toward the stick, dodging the fire. His hands latched onto the thick branch, and he rolled again. His leg ached as an old injury reminded him of his age. He had closed the gap, though, and he swung. The stick connected, and like a baseball, the sphere cracked and was launched away from Rodney's charred corpse. The sphere bounced as the fiery bird followed it. It landed down in its hole near the plate. Beth kicked into action and ran toward the sluice Rodney had built, kicking it open. Water flowed out of the puddle and swamped the silvery sphere. The fire struggled, pulled in and down. Then it squelched out, and only a small blue flame poked out from small holes in the sphere's side. Travis scooped up some muddy clay and walked over, dropping it onto the orb. They sat watching it until the sun came up. Beth had distributed headlamps, and Travis would periodically fill buckets of water and dump them into the hole as it steamed. Fiona looked up at him and then over at what was left of Rodney. "What are we going to tell people? We have to get the police out here." Travis didn't look up from the steaming puddle. "Doesn't take a lot of science, but people aren't going to believe it." Beth stared at him. He looked over at the young woman, soot smeared on her face. "Phoenixes, dragons, the myths. This thing, whatever it is, the bodies you found weren't worshippers, were they?" Fiona looked over at him, her eyes blinded by his headlamp. "I thought they were. There's a lot of broken pottery around them." He sighed. "Fire brigade. They were fighting it, lured it maybe. Got it here in the mud and drowned it." Beth nodded. "This bog is always wet. That's smart. The cover stones are probably their way to warn anyone. Leave it here. Let it rot in the mud. Keep it drowned," he said. Fiona whimpered a bit and wiped a tear from her eye. "We're still going to have to tell someone. Rodney's family needs to know." Travis took a deep breath. "I know some people. They can handle things like this. They'll believe me and we'll get it properly taken care of." Beth laughed. "You know people?" He nodded and looked over at Rodney. "He's not my first friend to fall. We're going to make sure he gets his respect." Professor Hawkins then got up and went to his tent to make some phone calls.